RxQ and basically how it's an observable wrapper for the Kix Engine API. And today I want to go through some basic examples of how we actually use it. So if you didn't catch last time's video, you can see it on my YouTube channel, which is at YouTube. Just search Spiros Kokinis, or my email, spiroskokinis@gmail.com. You'll find a video called RxQ Recipes Explained, Part 1. And that really walked through what is RxQ, what does it do, what are the kind of core concepts and backgrounds you need to use it. What it didn't walk through is actual code examples. So what we've done for the latest version of RxQ is put together 21 different recipes. Each recipe is meant to explain a different concept and how you would do something with the Kix engine, like connecting to an engine, getting the version, opening a document, and it keeps scaling up like that until at the end you're doing much more complex things like auto reconnecting a session after going offline and back online, or toggling between different sessions, or making selections on application opening and things like that. So I'm really going to jump right into it. What we've done this time around with the recipes is we provided a code sandbox that points at one of our demo servers and allows you to play with RxQ right away. So you can go to any of these examples and you'll find the code for the example. And if you click the code sandbox link, it'll take you here and you'll see that kind of example running. So this is the get the engine version example. And you will see that it gets the engine version and prints it. And here's the code for it. And if you want to change that, you can just click edit on code sandbox, and now you'll be editing it yourself and you can explore RxQ yourself. So that's there for every single recipe that we have. But what we can do to start off is I have a blank sandbox. I want to walk you through step by step some of the recipes over the next half hour. So I'm really going to start with the most basic recipe, which is connecting to an engine. So the way to connect to an engine is first I need to import the right functions from RxQ. In this code sandbox, you'll see I have two dependencies set up. I have RxQ imported, and I have RxJS, which is our reactive programming language that RxQ is using for reactive programming around click. So what we'll do is we'll start by importing a function from RxQ. And really what I'm going to import is the connect session function, because that's what I'm going to do. And so that comes from the connect subdirectory. So I'll import connect session. Now that's all I really need to create a session, is just that one function, but I have to tell it what are the parameters of my session. So we'll do that by setting up a configuration object. So RxQ takes a configuration object. If you look at the documentation under connecting, you'll see all the different possible parameters we could put in as part of that. So we could put in a host name for where we want to connect to. We can put in, is it a secure connection, so is it using SSL or not. We can put in the port that we're going to connect to if it's not the default ports for our server, and other optional things like looking at adding tickets for authentication and things like that. So in our case, we're going to keep it really simple. We're going to create this object, and we're going to have the host, and the host is going to be sense.accessgroup.com, which is a public server. And the second piece, we don't need the ports because we already have the it's on the default ports that ClickSense runs on when installed. But we do want to put in, is it a secure connection or not? And we're going to put true. Yes, we're going to use SSL. And so that's our configuration object. It's defining our configuration. Now to create an observable for our session, what we'll do is we'll call connect session, and we'll just pass it the config. So this creates for us that observable with the session. It doesn't actually connect the session. Remember from the prior video, or if you're familiar with RxJS, that observables are cold. They don't do anything unless someone is observing them. So they really have a kind of a pull model. Values get pulled from them. So what we can do here is we can add a subscriber to this to initiate it, and we'll just log out the result of this connect session observable. And what you'll see in the console is a handle. So it has a handle for the global class. You can see the handle is -1. It has a reference to the session that we've now established, which it uses behind the scenes to do communication with the server. And it has the invalidated stream. So remember we talked about last time that all handles have this concept of invalidation, where the Kix engine during our session will let us know if the data we have for that handle is the latest data that's available or not. And when it's not, we'll be out of sync, and so we'll be invalidated. So this observable gives us that sequence of events that's coming from click, so we can use that to react if we need to. And just to show this, if we pull up our network tab here, and let me give it a refresh. So I'm in Google Chrome, and a really useful way to debug what's happening with the Kix engine is to open your DevTools in Google Chrome and go to the network tab and click WebSocket. And when you do that, what will happen is, if this thing loads, that you can monitor the WebSockets that are getting established and see what's happening within them. So if I click on this, you see the WebSocket got created correctly. You see a sample function method get called. That just is a method we use to make sure that we're authenticated and that everything connected properly, because otherwise we want to give you an error saying, like, hey, we weren't able to connect you, maybe because of authentication or something else. So that's it. We have a session. We've kind of accomplished that. So that's it. Now you're connected to the Kix engine, and you can start to do some API things. So let's do that. So the second exercise from the recipe from the documentation is to get the engine version. So let's get the engine version. We'll just print it to the console. So the engine version is a function of the global class. So if you need to know or are curious about what are the different methods that you can call in each handle, it's all documented in the API reference here. So I can go to the developer help section and go to API reference and click on engine API and look at the classes and find the global class, which represents the session that I'm in, and that's what I got returned from my connect session call. And you can find functions like engine version or get doc list, things like that. So let's go ahead and make one of those calls. So the first thing we need to do is import that function from RxQ. So we'll import from RxQ. What you can do is really import this a few different ways. You can get the actual function from RxQ/global. So we organize all of the observable creators based on the click class they consume. So I could say from RxQ, let's import engine version. And that will give me capital G for code Sandbox. And that'll give me the engine version function that I can use. This is really important for if you're doing like a browser bundle, because importing it this way will allow your bundlers like Webpack or Parcel or Rollup and things like that to do what's called tree shaking. Tree shaking essentially gets rid of the code from packages that you're not using. Like I'm not using the open doc or get doc list code here or the open doc code here or anything like that. So when I deliver my app into production, I don't want to like bring all that with me. It's just extra code. It's dead code, right? So tree shaking allows us to get rid of that. When it bundles, it sees that that's not being used and it doesn't import it and include it with your production code. And so if we write syntax like this helps with tree shaking. It basically tells the program, hey, we're only going to use this component of this module. However, for development, sometimes it can be helpful if you don't know all of the functions that are available to do something like import just global from RxQ. And with that, then you'll have to call like global.engineVersion or global.getDocList. But it's a nice convenient way because you don't have to keep adding to your imports. So some people find that useful when they're doing development, just kind of exploring the APIs. So they don't have to keep like adding imports. They just import every method of the class. In our case, we know what we're going to use, so we're going to just use the kind of tree shaking way. So we have our engine version function here. Now we need to call our engine version function. And what our engine version function does, like all of the methods in RxQ, is that it takes in the handle that it's going to act on, and then any parameters you need for that method. So that engine version function by itself doesn't really do anything. I need to tell it, I want you to get the engine version for this session, so for this handle of global. Now, our global was provided to us asynchronously from this observable. So let's do a little bit of refactoring, and let's call this our session variable. And this is the observable that delivers for us a global handle. So we need to take that global handle that arrives asynchronously and then make another async call for the engine version with it. RxJS is really good at this type of like chaining of asynchronous operations. It does that with what are called higher order observables, which are basically observables of observables that can then be flattened. So it's like an async call that makes an async call, but I want it all collapsed into a single final output that's delivered. So if you go through the documentation on RxQ, there's some good links for high order observables in the making API calls section. It'll talk about leveraging high order observables, and we link out to a nice, very good course about how to use high order observables. So it's a really important concept for RxQ because of all the asynchronous operations we're dealing with. But let's start here and just kind of skip to the answers, which is that in our case we want to use an operator called SwitchMap. So we'll import that from RxJS. And what SwitchMap does is it takes a value coming from an observable and maps that to another observable, so in our case another asynchronous call, and then flattens the results back into a stream of the result of the inner observable. So it's a lot of words. I think it makes a lot more sense if we type it out. So let's get the engine version. And the way we'll get the engine version is we'll take that session that's coming through and we'll start a pipe, which is how we do transformations, how we use operators in RxJS. We'll say in this pipeline we want to take the result of this session observable and we want to do a switch map with it. And this session observable we saw is giving us back a global handle, which I'm just calling H. You could call it handle, you could call it global, you can call it whatever you want. I just call it H to remind myself it's a handle. And then with that handle, I'm going to return an observable by taking the engine version function and giving it that handle. Engine version doesn't need any other parameters. It just gets the engine version. You don't have to tell it anything else. So essentially what I'm saying is take this handle that got delivered to us from this session observable and make an asynchronous call for the engine version on it. And then using SwitchMap, give me back that result of that inner call. So if I log this out, what you will see here is the component version, which is how they deliver the engine version from the engine, is written out here. So we're connected to an engine version 12.34.11. So that's simply how you make a call. We could easily replace this. We could do other calls. We could do get doc list, for example. Just replace this with get doc list. And now the doc list is being spit out. Here are all the different documents that are on our demo server. So it's very easy to leverage once you know the operators. So let's keep going. The next one is making multiple global calls. So what you've seen me do so far is kind of do one call at a time in my function. You know, I did engine version, I did get doc list, but I didn't do them both at the same time, like make multiple calls to a single session. Now to do that requires a better understanding of hot versus cold observables, which you can read up on. It's mentioned in the documentation. But essentially, as I mentioned before, observables are cold in RxJS, so they produce values for every listener that they get, every subscriber or observer. And in cold observables, they really produce a new set of values for every observer. So when someone subscribes to the session, that starts up a session and delivers them the global handle. If a second person subscribes to the same variable, it actually spins up another session. So if I were to do something like session $.subscribe, that is one session. That's kind of my first session. If I do it again, this actually becomes a second session. The observable function creates a new session for every observer. Now in an click environment, we don't really want that normally. You know, if we're creating a dashboard, we really want to reuse these handles, these global handles, to make multiple calls within the same session. Like what I really want to do is I want to call engine version and I want to call get doc list within a single session. So we can do that in RxJS by doing what's called multicasting, which will turn this cold observable into a hot observable. There's a lot of different ways to do multicasting with different types of behavior. If you look at the reusing handle section, I talk about some of the strategies and link out to some very good articles that explain the concepts. In our case, I'll show you the one that we commonly use at Axis Group, at least, when we're doing our development, and that's share replay. So what share replay does is it says the first time someone subscribes to this, the first observer that comes in, set up the session. For anyone else that comes after that, share that session and share the last value that you delivered within that last session that got provided. So to do that, all we'll have to do is just add a little pipe operator here, or pipe function with an operator, and call our share replay operation. So I do that, and now both of these will share the same session. So anytime you're using a handle, like getting a global handle or opening a document to get a doc handle or generic object handle, you're almost always going to want to do this share replay statement so that you can make multiple calls to it. So in our case, now we can do something like we'll have our engine version, and that's just taking the session, and again, we'll apply the SwitchMap, which provides us, when we get the handle from the session, observable, we'll take that handle and we'll call engine version on it. And similarly, we'll do the doc list. Once again, we want to use that session. This time it's being shared, so there's no issues with these two spinning up different sessions. We'll use our SwitchMap operator, which says when this value comes in, switch it to the result of another asynchronous call. In this case, it's the getDocList call. And now I can just subscribe to both of these, and they will share the session properly. So I'll log this. And there you see both happen. There's the engine version coming through, and here is the document list coming through. Perfect. So that is how we do a couple different engine calls. Really, the next step is to open an application, right? We want to get into an app and probably do some things with it. Look at properties, really do calculations and filtering is really the end goal, right, for dashboarding. So let's mock that up. What I'm going to do is first we're going to import a different function from the global. We're going to use the OpenDoc method. So OpenDoc takes an app ID or an app name, depending if you're in ClickSense Desktop, and connects to that application. It opens it into memory and gives you the handle for it in your session so that you can work with that handle. You can work with that document and make selections and things like that. Now, when we do that with a session like this, it's a good practice to provide the session name in the configuration. So let's go ahead and first define our app ID, and then I'll explain why that is. We'll just call this app name. And I'll look at my example to get my app name because I don't remember the GUID from the server. So there's the GUID for the app. So what I can do here, I don't have to do this, but I'll explain why it's useful, is I can actually provide the app name in the configuration, and it'll use that to scope my session for this application. Now this is important because in a session in Click, you can only have one application open at a time. And so if you aren't scoping your session, like telling Click, like, oh, I'm connecting to a unique kind of session namespace here, or whatever it might be, you could potentially try to open a doc in a session that already had a document open, and then you'll get errors and you won't be able to work within that. Like let's say you were just connecting to a generic session without any kind of scoping, and you opened a sales.qvf file, and then you reconnected to the same session where sales.qvf was still open, but you try to open expenses.qvf. Click wouldn't be able to do that, and it would give you an error back. So by giving it an app name in this config, it handles setting up your session such that it kind of scopes the session for that application. This really doesn't matter if it's the right GUID or not. All it matters is consistency. Like we're telling it this is the app that we're scoping for. So we'll put that in here, and we'll create our session the same way. Don't have to change anything there. But the next step is creating our application, or opening our application rather. So to open the application, we need to get the global handle and call OpenDoc on it. So again, we'll use pipe, and we'll use the SwitchMap operator, which gives us back the global handle, and this time we call OpenDoc on it. Now one difference here from our last examples is that this does take an additional parameter, and that parameter is the name of the application that we want to open. So basically telling RxQ, use this global handle that we got and open this application in it. Since it is a handle we're going to get back, let's go ahead and share it. Even though we don't need it for this particular example, it's just a best practice because if you're building a dashboard, you're going to use the app handle a lot, so you will want to be sharing it. across subscribers. So we'll just log this out to make sure that we got the application handle, the document handle, and you can see it gets logged out. So there's our doc class, it's a handle, it's handle number 1, has an invalidation stream, the session, etc. Cool, so we have that app. Now let's do something interesting with it. Let's try to get the properties from it. So just like we imported OpenDoc from the global class, we can import functions from the doc class. And specifically, we want to import the getAppProperties function because we want to take our app handle and find out properties of it. What's the name of this app? For example, I don't remember what the name of this app is because we just have the GUID here. So this is actually good for all of us to find out what that might be. So we'll take the application handle, or application observable, which returns the doc handle, and use that to get to the app properties. So you can see there's really a pattern here, like a repeating pattern, where you take a observable for a handle and you SwitchMap it or use some other flattening operator to calculate another asynchronous call on it. So we'll call this app props, and we'll take the app observable, and we'll do a SwitchMap. So this is giving us back the app handle, which means I can call getAppProperties on that app handle. There's no other parameters for the app properties, so we can just leave it like that. And if I subscribe to this, I'll just log out the results. There is the results. So I have Iris is the title of the application. Here's the last reload time. What version of Click was it saved in? Some other things like file size and things like that. Even information, let's see, about what, as a user, you can actually edit. Can you create things or not, etc. So yeah, pretty simple and straightforward to scale up to making all kinds of different calls. And we could just change this to other methods found in the documentation, and we'll be getting calls from the application that's open. One thing I want to call out that I didn't mention earlier, you may have noticed I call all of these variables with a $sign at the end. That is merely a formatting thing. It doesn't affect your code in any kind of way. It just helps remind me that these are observables and not just like a static variable. So this is not actually any kind of syntax within your code. It's purely a practice of mine to help me remember what's an observable and what's not. So we've got about 5 minutes left for this session, so let's go even further. Let's set up changing the app properties and listening for changes. So last week I walked through the kind of invalidation of handles. The idea being that, Click, when you open a session and open a document into memory, it's sort of like keeping track of the state of that document, and so those handles and their properties could change over time. Like if you were to save the document, then the last save time of the app property would be different. Or if you were to change the title directly of the app properties, then now the app properties are different on the server than what you might have that you pulled locally before. So we need Click, or Click needs to really tell us when things are changing. That's called invalidation, and we can use those events to make sure that we're kind of getting the right updates whenever things are changing on the server. So we're going to show that here now with this example. What we're going to do is we will set up a button on the page, and when we click this button, it's just going to create a random number and put it on the app properties on the server. Now what we want to do when that happens is we want to make sure that whenever that property changes on the server, we're aware of it and getting that information back, so that we have the latest, whatever that random number was, we know what it is. So let's start this by creating a button. And we'll call it set random prop. So there's our button. Now to do this sequence, we're going to use some RxJS functions to help us create some streams or observables that we can use with our RxQ observables. Like specifically, I want to get a stream of clicks from here and turn that into a random number. So I can import from RxJS a function to create observables called FromEvent. And RxJS has a bunch of these. You can find it in their documentation. But in the FromEvent function, what it does is it acts almost like an add event listener type code. You give it a DOM element and you give it the event type, and it creates a stream of that event type. So I could say, maybe I'll just set it up here that I have my click $, and that equals FromEvent, and we're going to give it the button. Just pull this over. And we're going to use the click event for that. And if I were to subscribe to that, you will see that every time I click this, an event is fired. So it's working. But I don't want to just like get this like random kind of DOM event. Really what I want to do is I want to translate that into a random number. So I will do that with some more RxJS operators. I'll use one called map. So I'll take this, let's just go ahead and change this to random number, and we'll put a pipe on this. So we have this stream of clicks from the event. We want to take that stream, and for each click we want to change it to a random number. And let me just add random number right here. Now if I click this button, you'll see that random numbers are getting spit out every time I click it. So it's taking the click event and mapping it to a random number, and now I have that. So far so good. We are able to generate random numbers. Now we want to set that property on the application properties. So there is a function in the dot class, just like we have get app properties, we have set app properties. So in the app class, we can find it right here. And all it takes in is a Q prop that has like information about the properties. Q title, Q last reload time, etc. We don't have to fill all this stuff out, I don't believe. Let me double check with my example from before. I believe we can just pass in new props, which we can. It'll keep the default ones. So really what we're going to do is we're going to do some more RxJS magic here to merge these observable events together. And that's really like the value of reactive programming, is it's kind of like Legos for async. You essentially take a bunch of different pieces and can plug them together to make new asynchronous pieces. So we can plug in our random number stream with our app properties stream and app handle stream to all into like some different logic very easily. Before I go forward, there's a question in the chat about, it says, is there a way to close an app on a session and then open a new app? There is not, as far as I know. I know for sure that it was not possible in version like 2 of ClickSense. I still don't think it's possible. I think that each session really is only for one application, and if you need to open a different application, you just have to create a different session, which you can do with Rx, and we actually have examples of that later on, so maybe that would be a good one to go deeper on in another session. So wrapping up here, we have the random number, and really what we want to do is we want to say every time someone generates a random number, we want to use the app handle and deploy this set properties function. So I'm going to import set app properties from the dot class. And what I will do down here is I'm going to say every time I have a random number, I want to use the latest app handle that's available. So there's an operator for this. It's called with latest from. And by the way, if you're curious about all the different operators, I mean, besides going through RxJS videos, which will teach you the main ones, and I found that very helpful, the API documentation is great. If you go to reactivex.io/rxjs and then go to the observable class, all the observable creators are documented here, like FromEvent, but also all the operators are documented here. And so if I search for with latest from, which we're about to use, we'll see a nice marble diagram that explains it. And so it basically says whenever this observable fires and this has a value, use the latest one of this value. So it kind of combines values together from two streams, but only when the first stream fires. So what we'll do is we will say we want this to happen every time random number goes off, and when it does go off, we want to get the latest handle from our app $. So we'll do that. And now we can make our API call. And remember, we want to use a SwitchMap to make API calls because we're going from async into an inner async, and we want to flatten that all back out. Now this time our input is going to be a little bit different. We're going to use destructuring for this, but essentially with latest from combines the two observables and adds like each one into an array. So the random number will be the first part of our array because it was the first observable in with latest from. So we'll have our, what I'll call our num for number. And then the second one will be the handle for the application because that's the order we combine these together. And then I can use that in a function, and what I can say is I want to set the app properties. I have the handle, and then the property I want to set, we'll just call it random, and we'll put in the num that got brought back. Now finally we need this thing to execute. Remember that in observable land, they're cold. They don't operate without an observer or unless you make them hot by multicasting, and there's different ways to do that. Now if we look at the documentation for set app properties and we look at, what does it actually return? It doesn't really return anything. So we don't really want to listen on that necessarily. I guess we could if we want to catch errors with it, which is something you could do. But if we didn't and we just trusted and wanted to just be kept alive, we can also do what's called publishing, which is another way to multicast. And so publishing essentially makes an observable hot in that it can be connected, and once it's connected, it's just running all the time. And that's what we want this one to do. We want this one to just run. We don't really care about observers for this one. So to do that, we'll use an operator called publish. And what you can do, we'll call this the set props stream. And we'll say we want this to be published. And when you have published going, what it really allows you to do is to connect it without doing any kind of subscription. So subscribe won't auto-connect this thing anymore or create multiple versions or anything like that. Really the only way to get it running is with setprops.connect. So it's a more advanced concept around multicasting, but these are very important concepts when you're working with RxJS and RxQ in highly asynchronous environments like these. So it's something I highly suggest getting familiar with. And we'll cover it many more times throughout this document, throughout these videos. So let's examine this bad boy in action. Let's pull up our WebSocket. We'll just refresh the page. It didn't say it. Let me save the sandbox. That's important. It's not saving for some reason. Okay, now it says it's saved. Let's open this. We'll refresh so we can observe the WebSocket and see if our button is actually working. There's our WebSocket. You can see it's scoped now. That app ID I put in there is in there, so that helps make sure that when I connect to a session, I know it's for that application, and I hopefully won't open the wrong application in there. And we'll see our calls from before. It opened the doc. It got the app properties. So far, so good. Really what we want to test is this button. If I click this button, does it set the app properties? So I'll click it, and I see set app properties. And it returned without an error, so it's working. And I can keep doing this. Now, the problem here, the last thing we haven't added in, is that we've made a mechanism to update all these app properties, but we haven't really created a mechanism for us to get those updated app properties. Like when we pulled the app properties from before, if I look in the console, let's just stay with since there's a lot of warnings in the console, let's stay here and look at the result of this. You'll see that there wasn't even a random property at the time that I did this. We'd never even made one. So if I'm listening to this, I really have no knowledge that this exists because I haven't gotten the latest data from Click. I'm out of sync with the server essentially because I've been updating the server. So this is what the invalidation events are for. What I can do is come back over here and we'll say, this is the stream where we got the app properties, right? We said take the app handle and just get the app properties one time. But really what I want to do is I want to get the app properties initially when I start the app, and I want to get the app properties anytime they change. This is what the invalidation events are for. So again, as you've seen when we were logging out the handle before, there's an invalidated $$ property on each handle. That is an observable of invalidation events. So anytime Click tells us something changed, we can get that event from that observable. So what I can do is I can actually put a switch map in front of this for the handle and say take the handle, and with that handle we are going to change it. We're going to map it to the invalidation observable. So this observable returns the handle. This then maps it to an inner observable, and this flattens the whole thing out. So now what's going to happen is every time I press the button, maybe not. Oh, right. So we're missing one step here, which is that we didn't do the initial invalidation. So we didn't start with an initial get app properties to get this cycle going. So there's an operator from Rx that is great for this, which is just called start with. And so what start with does is it takes a stream like this, and it puts a default value to kick it off with. And so we want to kick this off with the handle. So we'll just put a pipe, like an inner pipe, and say start this whole thing with the handle. Okay, now we're getting app properties. So here was the initial one. No random property. We had not created it yet. However, when I press this button, we'll do one more thing. Here's something that's very important when you're working with RxQ and Code Sandbox, for example. It's doing hot module replacement, and we're adding all kinds of event listeners. And so when it's doing hot module replacement, like old event listeners are still kind of running in the background, even as we've kind of re-executed parts of our code. So sometimes you'll need to refresh the whole page to kind of reset things so that we have just the one active event listener. So in this case, this is the initial kind of starting with properties that executed. So we got our initial props. You'll see no random property in there. If I click set random prop, you'll see that it sent me a new set of properties. And that one has the random button, random value on it. And I can keep doing this. I can click random prop again, and it'll keep going. So I can just keep clicking this. And what's happening, if we were to kind of monitor the WebSocket, is essentially every time I click the button, it's updating the app properties. That's triggering an invalidation event. And I'm listening on the invalidation event and saying, hey, when that happens, give me the new properties. So I'm creating this kind of feedback loop for myself. So that's the initial get. Then I say set random prop. It sets the prop, tells me that it invalidated, and I automatically get the app properties again. Rinse and repeat over and over again. So this is basically how you build kind of updating objects and charts, which you'll see when we start to build things like list boxes and stuff like that, and charts where you need the data to stay in sync with click filtering. So just going to walk through this one more time a little bit slower because this is a really important concept. What we're doing for this app properties stream is we're taking the app handle observable, and that returns for us the handle. And with that handle, we have an observable inside of it called invalidated. And that'll fire every time that click tells us it has invalidated. So we're going to map our handle to that stream. So now that we have a stream of those invalidations. However, we also want to kick off with an initial kind of value. So we want to start with something and then keep invalidating after that. So we add the start with operator inside of this to say, okay, start with this handle and then keep pushing it every time it invalidates. Finally, we can then take that recurring stream of handles and call get app properties on them to get those, and then we just log those to the console. And again, this is how we set up a kind of hot stream to execute some event. We had our random number that was coming from clicking this button. We say when that happens, get the latest app handle, and combine those two things together to make this call, where we use the handle coming from one of them with the random number coming from the other to update the app properties. All right, that was a lot for day one, or kind of first cut of the recipes. Got through the first 6. This will be on YouTube, so you can rewatch it. If you have any questions, just reach out to me. I'm on the ClickBranch Slack. That's probably the best place to ask me questions about RxQ. Probably just like DM me or even in the Engine API thing. So yeah, thank you for watching.